In other words, there's a sense that we don't feel like we belong. We don't feel like we measure up. There's something in us that's struggling to find something to love in this world, such that we can say, you know what, even just for that, the world deserves to live. The world's terrible, but you know what? It's worth protecting because my mom is here, because my best friend is here. Nobody, especially not even themselves. It's a reflection of a self-hatred. It's quite the opposite of an empathy. It's a self-loathing. And because a person can loathe themselves so much, which is what we got from that manifesto that the shooter in Utah. It was a complete hatred of the self that then gets projected out into the world because they can't find something in themselves that they think is redeemable. And they blame the world. And surprise, surprise. You can't find anything in yourself. It's difficult to find somebody else who can love those things either. So you might get lucky. You might have a person who finds something beautiful inside of you or something lovable inside of you, even when you don't. You are what you are right now because the world has made you a certain way, family's made you a certain way, friends have made you a certain way, society made you a certain way, but this is where you are now. The question then becomes, now what? You may have been born into a great family. You may have been born into a terrible family. You may have been born into a regular family, a normal family. But the question in all three of those circumstances is exactly the same. Now what? You may have been born with a really high IQ. You may have been born with a very low IQ. You may have been born at normal average. The question now is, now what? And that's the perpetual question that a thinking person should always be asking themselves. Now what? Whatever situation you're in, now what? How can I make the best of this situation? Because at some point you have to give up your hope for a better past. Let's say that one school shooting, but that doesn't really narrow it down, does it? It was that trans kid who went and shot like a Christian school. I want to say it was in Texas. I'm not sure exactly where it was. Yeah.
I think it was in Utah.
Utah? Okay. So they found like the one Christian school in Utah to go shoot up. Nice. And they had a manifesto, and the police have never released it. But some of it got smuggled out by some of the police officers. Some police officers got pictures of a few pages of it, and then they released it. And when you listen to it, when you read it, it isn't like a coherent complaint. It's just like a general rage against people. And you kind of wonder, like, where does that general rage come from? And then you might say, well, it might come from the fact that they're not accepted. Or maybe the fact that they're not accepted is what pushed them in that direction in the first place. In other words, if there's a particular rage and hatred towards people, it comes from somewhere. You know? So it's a matter of trying to figure out where that somewhere is. Because the death of the world, man, that's a big thing. That's not just like, Tuesday. But you find this. Have you guys ever heard of Columbine before? Columbine shooting? Good. And, as I said, it's good, but it's not good that it happened, but that you've heard of it. It was 1997, I think it was, something like that. And it was like the first mass publicized school shooting. It was in Columbine, Colorado. It's an interesting one also because if you look hard enough, you can find the surveillance footage of it because the school had surveillance videos set up. So you can see how everything went down. And there's a lot of really interesting lessons to learn from it, man. I talk about, for example, most of the deaths happened in the library. And the school had their sirens going off as the lockdown was a serious situation. And you see the kids. No one's taking it seriously. And you can hear, and they're kind of they go out to the library and they're looking and they're oh my God, they're laughing and kind of joking around. And all of a sudden you can literally see their faces shift the second that they realize why this is going on, which is that there are two gunmen running up the hallway shooting people. And you can see their faces turn from laughter, oh, this is whatever, to just sheer terror as they turn and they run. And then the shooters run up behind them and take a knee and just start picking them off as they're all running back into the library. And as they run into the library, what do? Well, when you're in an emergency, what do? What's that? Take cover, yeah. And where do you take cover when there's an emergency? The library. Yeah, but if you're in the library, even if you're in here, if there's An emergency, where do we take?
Right.
What? Yeah, under the desks. So the librarian is yelling at the kids, get under the desks, get under the desks. You know, why? Because that's what you do in an emergency. What kind of an emergency were they prepared for? Earthquake. So they start acting the way that they would if this was an earthquake. And so people start acting in these really strange ways because you fall back on kind of like training or instinct. And if ever since kindergarten you've been told, get underneath the desk, stop, cover and roll, whatever. There's this part of the video is that there's this in the library, and there's a hallway like this. These are bookshelves, and the kids are running. One kid who's at the front of the line goes like this around the desk and then runs. Why? Because he's not thinking. You just see like an area where you can run, so then you turn, and then you can't go that way, so then you keep going. And so all the kids behind this person all did the exact same thing. There's like one kid who's like running way behind everybody. He's the slowest one. He's a couple seconds behind them. He then goes straight because there's nobody in front of him for him to follow. In other words, you see them start behaving in really, really strange ways. But then you kind of realize, no, it's not strange. It totally makes sense. If you've never been in a situation like that, you have no idea what it is that you would do. And so we try to prepare for things. Like we have like drills, we have we read off like pamphlets about here's what you should do. But until you're actually in a real situation like that, so, I'm almost done responding to you. It's on Jupiter. So you have no idea what it is that you would do in a situation like this. Any of you guys, when you go into a restaurant, like look for the exits or something? Or you ever ask yourself, like if there was a problem in here, not just a shooting, but if there was some kind of a problem, you ever think about what you would do in that scenario? Yeah, you should. And not as a way of being paranoid, but as a way of just kind of like preparing yourself for things. Because it isn't that the world's this terrible, scary place and there's a shooter around every corner. It's not that at all. It's just that when you don't, what you end up doing is you end up following the person in front of you. So when the person in front of you turns left, you're going to turn left. When the person yelling at you, get underneath the desks, is a librarian, you're going to get underneath the desks. And spoiler alert for you, most of the people who were killed in that shooting were killed underneath the desks in the library. Because the shooters, and again, they're on video, they're going around. And they're like seeing people underneath desks and they're figuring out who they know and who they don't. And they're shooting people underneath the desks as they're all hiding. And even as they're hiding and they're going desk by desk, because one kid, they pulled him out. And when that happens, other kids, they don't run away. There is a back exit, by the way, to the library. There is a way out of there. But you end up, when you're in situations like that, you just go completely tunnel vision. You just don't see it. Now again, that's not just in a shooting. That's in most stressful situations in life. Unless you've dealt with stress before, unless you've thought about what you might do beforehand, when you find yourself in these situations and you go off of instinct, you just go into like almost like this survival mode, but the survival mode that a lot of people think it is, which is fight or flight. Fight is not the default. The default is to work with is to seek safety, and in their minds that means not running away. In other words, your body just kind of shuts down, and you kind of go into like this. How'd you describe it? Like almost like a disbelief. Like you want to believe it's not real. But my point of it is that one of the shooters in Columbine, he was wearing a shirt that said natural selection. Natural selection. Why would he have chosen that shirt to wear on that day? And we happen to know, because they made videos of themselves leading up to the shooting, talking about why they were doing it, because they knew the videos would be found eventually. And they had planned to kill themselves, which they did do at the scene. They killed themselves in the library. Everybody was either gone or dead or whatever. The place was surrounded. The cops were outside. They weren't going to get out. So they committed suicide together in that library. So they knew they weren't coming out. So why is it that he would have that shirt on? He explains it in the videos. Because he believes that the world is so terrible, that people are so awful, that none of us deserves to live. At 18 years old, he felt that he had enough knowledge, and enough experience, and enough wisdom to make that decision for everybody. Now, afterwards, people looked at that and said, oh my God, they were bullied. That's what caused it, they were bullied. Turns out, no, after the investigation, they were not bullied, although that did become like the popular idea about it. In fact, As the investigation turned out, they were the bullies. This wasn't something that was, put on them. This is something that they were. And it's interesting because even in one of the videos, one of the kids, he's quoting Shakespeare. He's saying, don't blame my parents. And he says, good wombs have borne bad sons. In other words, our parents were great. This is just what we're doing. But they decided that people just didn't deserve to live, and especially certain kinds of people. And so they decided that for all of humanity, they were the judge of all of humanity, and that they could judge humanity, they could judge their classmates, and that they could weigh them, they could measure them, and that after all of that, they'd find them wanting, and they were not measuring up to deserving to live. Now, imagine if they didn't do that. Imagine if instead they went into politics. Imagine if they became very powerful senators, or even a president, and they had the US military at their command. What kind of damage do you suppose people like that would do? In fact, even just make them CEOs of companies if they have a lot of economic power. What kind of things do you think people like that would do? There are people out there, there's a lot of them. In fact, so I'll finish that last thought. There are a lot of people out there who just look at the world and say, it shouldn't exist. We're so terrible. I see these things like people post on Instagram, like, we don't deserve dogs. It's like, my God, like there's this hatred towards humanity, this judgment of humanity saying, we're just so terrible. For the last election, people have bumper stickers that say like Trump 2024 or Harris 2024. I saw people with bumper stickers that said intergalactic asteroid 2024. And it was a picture of like an asteroid hitting Earth. Like, oh, I just hope it just wipes us all out. And you only have that view if you have such an incredibly low view of humanity, the idea being that humanity itself doesn't deserve to live. And to have that view, that means that the people around you, if you have a friend, or if you are that person who has that view, man, the people around you should look at you sideways, because you're essentially saying nobody on earth deserves to live. Not even my best friends, not even my mom, not even this person. And by the way, not even the dogs that we don't deserve. It's a judgment of all of humanity. But moreover, where does that judgment come from? Same place that all monsters come from. It's a judgment of ourselves. It's the inner deadness. In other words, there's a sense that we don't feel like we belong. We don't feel like we measure up. There's something in us that's struggling to find something to love in this world, such that we can say, you know what, even just for that, the world deserves to live. There's no one person that any of us look at and say, you know what, the world's terrible, but you know what, it's worth protecting because my mom is here, because my best friend is here. Nobody, especially not even themselves. It's a reflection of a self-hatred. It's quite the opposite of an empathy. It's not just an empathy, it's a self-hatred. It's a self-loathing. And because a person can loathe themselves so much, which is what we got from that manifesto of the shooter in Utah, it was a complete hatred of the self that then gets projected out into the world because they can't find something in themselves that they think is redeemable. And they blame the world for their inability to be accepted or loved or appreciated. And surprise, surprise, you can't find anything in yourself. It's difficult to find somebody else who can love those things either. So you might get lucky. You might have a person who finds something beautiful inside of you or something lovable inside of you, even when you don't. And that happens quite a bit, but especially, you get to a certain point where you've got to find those things in yourself. Otherwise, you end up looking and talking like Robert Lifton. Now, notice he's not saying this is a good thing. He's just saying some people may come to feel that only the world's death can enable them to overcome their own inner deadness. Now, there's a blaming of the world. I am the way I am because the world made me this way. That's a passive way of seeing it. You are what you are right now because the world has made you a certain way, your family's made you a certain way, friends have made you a certain way, society made you a certain way, but this is where you are now. The question then becomes, now what? You may have been born into a great family. You may have been born into a terrible family. You may have been born into a regular family, a normal family. But the question in all three of those circumstances is exactly the same. Now what? You may have been born with a really high IQ. You may have been born with a very low IQ. You may have been born at normal average. The question now is, now what? And that's the perpetual question that A thinking person should always be asking themselves, now what? Whatever situation you're in, now what? How can I make the best of this situation? Because at some point you have to give up your hope for a better past. But for a lot of people, it's very comfortable. I'm messed up, I'm the way I am because it's your fault, because it's somebody else. No, we are where we are. Other people contributed to it, 100%. But again, I'll ask that question. Now what? You can let it affect you the rest of your life, however short or long that is, but then the life is never really yours. The life is only what other people have made. And that's where the hatred comes from, the self-hatred comes from. The awareness that the life that you're living is not really your own. But the deeper hatred comes in when you realize you could have made it something different, but chose not to. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, criticisms, critiques? Sorry about that one, man. Happy Monday, though.